Chapter 3. And here are the portraits of some of my favorite victims, Alastor said proudly, pausing to show off his work. Sometimes when a kill is particularly memorable, I'll commission a painter to paint the prey before I eat them and send their souls to the lake of fire. Quite lovely. Wouldn't you say? Vaggie, of course, couldn't respond through her gag, but she rolled her eyes and looked askance while fighting against the rope tying her hands together behind her back. Alastor sighed and said disappointedly, "Oh, Rosie. She's not interested in any of it. Whatever shall I do?" "You could always add another punishment," Rosie said sadistically, placing her cold hands on Vaggie's shoulders. "You could place a blindfold over her eyes so that the chain around her neck is the only thing guiding her forward. What do you think, Vaggie? Would you respect your new home more if Alastor's voice was the only thing guiding you through it?" Panic crossed Vaggie's eyes for only a second before her eyes settled into a glare. Rosie stared at that glare for only a moment before Alastor replied, "Oh, Rosie, you are too cruel. How is Vaggie supposed to navigate her new home if she can't see it? You would keep her locked in her room for all eternity, except for the special occasions you visit," Rosie said excitedly, getting in his face. "The claustrophobia and the loneliness will break her down for sure. I've seen it time and again. The isolation is enough to drive any demon mad. The claustrophobia just makes it happen faster. She'll become your bride before you know it." Vaggie decided to stop listening to the two kingpins deciding her fate and took the opportunity to fight back against her hands' restraints without interruption. She strained and strained against the rope, but it was no use. The knots were tied too well and her fingers couldn't get a good grip on them. Vaggie sighed into her gag before she came up with another idea. She remembered a movie she watched as a teenager where the main character managed to escape with his hands tied behind her back. That character had moved her hands in front of her and chewed apart the knots in the rope. Conceivably, Vaggie could do the same thing. So, while her captors continued their discussion, Vaggie sat down on the ground and lowered her hands so that they were just behind her bottom. Then, having leaned back so that her hands were flat on the floor, she scooted backwards until her legs went through the loop of her arms and her hands were in front of her instead of behind her. Vaggie smiled underneath her gag. She never realized she was that flexible. She could chew apart the knots now, but first, she had to get her chain away from her captors. Vaggie looked up to see that Alastor was not gripping the chain very tightly and smiled again. She grabbed the chain with her bound hands as gently as she could so as not to get their attention. Then, Vaggie pulled the chain as hard as she could. The chain slipped out of Alastor's hand, but it was caught by Rosie's. Alastor and Rosie looked over in Vaggie's direction as the latter said, "Oh, look, Alastor. The dog learned a new trick. Isn't that adorable?" Vaggie responded by tightening her grip and delivering another glare. "Rosie, that's rude," Alastor replied. "I mean, she went through all this trouble just to impress us. Vaggie deserves a reward. Don't you think?" "Oh, Alastor, what a grand idea!" Rosie exclaimed. "How should we reward her?" Vaggie had enough of their degrading banner. She pulled back on the chain even harder than before. Rosie smiled at her spirit and let go of the chain, causing Vaggie to fall on her back and hit her head. The pair then walked over and stood over her condescendingly while Vaggie caught her breath underneath the gag. "Vaggie, sweetheart, are you all right?" Alastor asked condescendingly. "You look so tired and flustered. Here, let me carry you the rest of the way." Without another word, Alastor scooped Vaggie up into his arms, snapped his fingers, and made the chain and leash disappear. Vaggie instantly started breathing more easily. "Alastor, dear, are you sure that's a good idea?" Rosie asked skeptically. "Of course," Alastor replied, carrying the disoriented Vaggie down the hall bridal style. "A dog doesn't need a leash if she's being carried. Besides, it's a good reward. Don't you think?" "I suppose," Rosie conceded. "We don't have far to go anyway." In about a minute, Vaggie regained her senses and saw that she was being carried up the stairs. Once they reached the top of the stairs, Alastor announced, "We're here at the tea room, Vaggie." Vaggie looked in front of her to see Rosie open the door to a small room. Without a word, Alastor carried Vaggie inside. Inside the tea room was a table with 3 chairs and a still steaming teapot sitting on top of it. The room was decorated completely in red from the curtains to the walls to the carpeted floor and the chairs. A large window looked out over the forest and the courtyard below. Alastor sat Vaggie down on one of the chairs, put a napkin on her lap, and said, "Alrighty, Vaggie, my dear. I'm going to remove your gag now so that you may enjoy your tea. If I do that, do you promise to behave?" Vaggie looked at him and reluctantly nodded. She would have to go along with what Alastor wanted until she found an opportunity to escape. Before Alastor could remove the gag, however, his ears started twitching and he stood alert. "Alastor, dear, do you hear something?" Rosie asked. "Yes, it is probably nothing, but one can never be too careful." Alastor tapped his cane on the ground, summoning several of his deer familiars. Vaggie watched fearfully as Alastor said, "All right, my dears, I order you to check the premises for an intruder. I want its heart." As the familiars set to work, Alastor turned to Rosie and said, "Rosie, will you entertain my guest for a little while? I have to make sure my home is safe." "Of course, dear," Rosie said as Alastor opened and shut the door behind him, leaving Vaggie alone with the kingpin. Vaggie and Rosie stared at each for a tense second before Rosie broke the silence. "How do you like your tea, dear?" Vaggie couldn't verbally respond but glared as she used her feet to scoot her chair closer to the table. Rosie looked up and noticed Vaggie's still gagged mouth and replied, "Oh, that's right. How silly of me to forget. I'll surprise you and you can tell me yourself once your gag is removed." Rosie poured the tea into the cup and said, "I know you'll love it, Vaggie. It's a special herbal blend I invented myself." Vaggie stopped scooting and sat in wait. "You know," Rosie said as she stirred some cream and sugar into the cup, "a long time ago, I would have envied you. Alastor has always been so charming, but his heart never felt the call of romance until he met you. Not that I can't see why, of course. You are so lively and modern." Rosie stood up, put the teacup in front of her, and said, "I hope you like the tea, dear daughter." Vaggie had kicked the table over, firing the hot tea right into Rosie's face. While Rosie was still blinded, Vaggie hopped to her feet and used her bound hands to open the door. "You will pay for this, you horrid ingrate," Rosie yelled after her as she shut the door behind her. Vaggie saw a large clock by the door and kicked it down to block the door. Then she ran down the stairs while pulling her gag down, finally allowing herself to breathe normally. "Keep yourself alive, Angel," Vaggie whispered out loud. "We're getting out of here."
I'm glad you enjoyed that video / gameplay. Just remember to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below. Until next time, goodbye!